Hello, hello, and welcome to another edition of the Sunday Night SitDown. I am your host, Miracle Jones. Today we have a special guest. This evening we are a couple of weeks out from the May 17th primary election, and our special guest this evening is Congressman Connor Lamb, who is joining us because he is running as one of the three individuals competing for the Senate seat, the Democratic Senate seat here in Pennsylvania. And without further ado, welcome to the Sunday Night SitDown, Connor Lamb.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're heavy on the campaign trail. Can you just talk a little bit about what inspired you to enter the Senate race for Pennsylvania?
Sure. I've been serving in the House of Representatives for 4 years. I was first elected in the spring of 2018. And, since that time, the Democrats have been in the majority in the House most of that time. And we've passed a number of important bills that I think would really have just made lives better for a lot of people in Western Pennsylvania. Something as simple as raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, or trying to lower people's drug prices. Childcare is a big issue for a lot of families. We recently passed a bill that would make it so that no one ever had to spend more than 7% of what they earn on childcare. Or maybe of particular interest on this show, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, we passed a bill called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that would actually reform the way that police departments are run and how they're trained, and impose a lot more accountability on them. And all those things that I mentioned and many more, they pass the House of Representatives and then they go nowhere from there. And that's because in the United States Senate, the Republicans have the advantage, and they use that mostly just to stop things. They don't usually propose another way of doing it or a way of working with us on a lot of these issues. And so it just became clear to me that if we didn't go out and try to win this Senate seat and put the Democrats in the majority, we're just not going to get anything done on a lot of these issues. And I'm sure you guys probably see this. People are getting impatient. They know that we've been campaigning on these promises for a number of years, and they want to know why we're not getting them done. And I don't want to make excuses. I want to do something about it. And that's why I decided to run for the Senate.
Thank you so much. I know you talked about the issues that inspired you to run for Senate. Is there a political figure or a campaign spokesperson that you are looking to right now that inspires you and that you model your campaign after?
That's a great question. What inspired me the most probably was my grandfather served in the state Senate in Pennsylvania in the 1960s and 70s. It was before I was ever born. But when I was growing up, I spent a lot of time with him, and people would come up to him and thank him for something that he did for them 25 years ago. And it was always something very basic, like, he helped somebody get into college, or one person, I remember he helped them get their first driver's license, and things like that people remembered. And so I grew up thinking of politics in that way, that like it was a way to just help people with the little things they need to kind of get through life. And that made me want to serve in a similar way that he had.
Thank you for that. And like I said, you've been campaigning. Has there been anything that has surprised you, like about this campaign? I know, again, we're like 2 weeks out from the election, and you've been in office before, but has there anything that's been a little bit different from this election than any prior election?
I think the mood of the country is a little bit different. And that has surprised me to a certain extent. I mean, I know the pandemic was tough on a lot of people, and I think it affected a lot of people's thinking. But I will say that in 2018, when I first ran, there was a lot of energy on the Democratic side, I think in reaction to President Trump and trying to take back the House of Representatives so that we could hold him accountable. And then a lot of that was translated into 2020 as well, because we also had the presidential campaign to try to replace him. And I'm not sure this year in 2022 if our base has that same amount of enthusiasm. I'm not sure. I think that they might not, and that's been of concern to me, because I think we have a very tough election ahead of us this year. Just midterm elections usually are hard in a president's first term, and this is obviously a very high stakes Senate seat, as we were talking about. So I'm doing everything I can think of to try to inject some energy and uplift and morale into our troops here. But it has been a challenge up to this point, I'll admit.
I do appreciate your honesty. As you're talking about this campaign, you talk about and boosting morale. What are some of the issues that you are hearing about that people really, really want their senator to address come November?
Most of them are economic. So I was talking about, just kind of this issue of helping people with their basic costs, right? The price of food, of milk, of gas, all of these things have gone way up. And, most people are earning the exact same amount or receiving the exact same amount in Social Security that they were before. And so all of a sudden your check that you get every week or 2 weeks is just not going quite as far. And that's a scary feeling, right? If all of a sudden you feel like you can't afford the lifestyle that you were used to, that's very threatening. And so I think what people need to be hearing from us is, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do to help me kind of get my own personal budget back in balance? And that's where I think our proposals on lowering the cost of healthcare, forgiving student debt, and we've been pausing student debt during the pandemic, but trying to forgive some of it and make the rest of the loans easier to repay, raising people's Social Security check if you're a senior, lowering the price of drugs, lowering the price of health insurance. All those things, they really can mean something to a lot of the people that we want to represent. So that's really my focus. But then the other issue I would say that is coming up a lot, because I'm spending a lot of time in Philadelphia as well as Pittsburgh, is gun violence. And I know you're going to ask about that later, but it just really is, again, very scary to people. Parents of young kids are looking at another summer where they might have to keep them inside a lot, because they're just afraid of what happens when their kids go outside. And that shouldn't be the case for any child in America. So there's a lot we have to do about that.
Thank you. And since you brought it up, we'll just go ahead and delve into it. Public safety continues to be a huge pressing issue across communities. And there is not, one right answer, one right solution. What are some of the things that you think your administration would be advocating for? And what is your approach to public safety?
Yeah, thank you for asking the question that way, because I agree. There is no one answer. And I think one of the things that separates the Democrats and the Republicans on this issue is whether or not you're willing to look at the root causes of violence and crime. I think the way the Republicans talk, they think if you just threaten people enough with strict enough sentences and more police and more prosecution, you're going to scare everybody into not committing crimes. There's probably some people that scares and deters, of course, but I think we all know that, especially in our large cities, there's things happening in the lives of young people over time that are leading them down this road, and they're not really listening to all the Republicans screaming bloody murder about locking people up. There's root causes, in other words, and it has to do with poverty. It has to do with a legacy of mass incarceration that removed a lot of role models from these communities and made it hard for people to get work. And it also has to do with being in a country where there are just way too many guns, and a lot of them move around very freely and illegally. So a lot of the shootings that happen, almost all of them are committed with firearms that the person who's doing the shooting doesn't own or doesn't own legally. That's the kind of work I used to do in the U.S. Attorney's Office, is trying to stop these firearm traffickers, is what they call them. But they're basically people that drive out to Westmoreland County or someplace like that, buy a bunch of guns, and then come back into the city or Penn Hills or Wilkinsburg or McKees Rocks or whatever the case, and then sell it to people who are not legally capable of buying a gun. And then those guns end up getting used in crimes. So I think as a senator, of course, you're not running for the position of police chief or DA or mayor. You don't have as much day-to-day impact on the crimes being committed. But an issue like gun trafficking is an issue that we could really affect from the federal level, because our ability to do these investigations and do more of them so that we actually try to stop the flow of guns, it has a lot to do with the funding that we supply to federal agencies like the ATF or to lawyers in the Department of Justice, and the direction that we give them. Ultimately, federal law enforcement is supposed to listen to Congress about what its priorities are. And so I think we could do a better job focusing on gun violence as the most pressing issue. There's still a lot of federal law enforcement that is very focused on fighting the war on drugs. And with respect to fentanyl and heroin and things like that that are killing people, that's valid. But I think there's still a lot of resources that go to things that may not be saving people's lives. Whereas if we focused on gun violence, we could save a lot more lives.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that thought out answer. And sticking a little bit around with the thing of public safety, because you're talking about, crime, violence. There's also been a call for criminal justice reform, and I know you mentioned, some of the drug laws and things in your prior answer. As a senator, what do you think that you could be instrumental in changing when it comes to criminal justice reform?
Sure. It's interesting. When before I was in Congress, and I was a federal prosecutor here in Pittsburgh, so we work under the Department of Justice, the Attorney General was Eric Holder. And in my first year, they brought all the brand new people down to Washington to hear from him. And I remember it really well. He got up in front of a ballroom full of career prosecutors, like very, very motivated people to go out and make our name and make our cases and all that stuff. And he said, one of our goals here in the Obama administration is for there to be fewer people in federal prison when we leave than when we got here. And I remember kind of being struck by that and thinking, but we're the prosecutors. Our job was to put people in prison who break the law. But his point was a really good one, which is that for a long time, we locked up a lot of people in this country for very long periods without necessarily it making us any safer. And so he wasn't trying to make the country less safe. He was trying to make the country more safe, but realizing that it had gotten to the point that too many people were in jail for too long. And so they put together some policies in that administration that we followed, for example, to resentence people who had been sentenced for crack cocaine, even though, white people using powder cocaine had gotten a much lighter sentence. We resentenced them. And some of those people walked out of jail that same day. They granted more pardons. They did things like for people that were succeeding in some of the rehabilitation programs, they got them into halfway houses earlier so that they were out of jail. And then in our office, I helped us start these kind of deterrence programs where if you caught somebody in a case and they really weren't a big player and say they had a job or some skills or a family that was willing to support them, we would give them a chance to turn their life around and then, not indict them or drop the case if after a year's time, they showed that they had really learned their lesson. We tried innovative things like that to reduce some of the load while still giving the public the benefit of, being protected from people that were doing the wrong thing. And we have a bunch of policies like that in the Congress that we can make into laws. Again, if we hold a Democratic majority.
Thank you for that. And my last question around the safety is, you talk a little bit about creating these innovative programs. And you also talked at the top of the hour about a lot of people feeling, the weight of inflation. What are some of the economic advancements that you would hope that you would be able to push, not only as a Democratic senator, but as a person like in the majority, knowing that there is a lot of conversation of how particularly Southwestern PA is able to compete, financially and globally?
Yeah, great question. Big question. So I think, first of all, like I told you, I always try to start off just very laser focused on the simple components of a family's budget and what are we doing to try to get their costs down and maybe their pay up a little bit. So that's kind of that category of things. But as it relates to like more economic development, which I think is kind of the heart of your question, there's a lot of really important things that we can do, especially focused, by the way, on the Black community. So one of the things that came out of the pandemic was we would design these programs, like the most well-known one was the Paycheck Protection Program, where a small business could get money from the federal government to keep their people on the payroll in the early days of the pandemic. Well, it wasn't really designed very well for a lot of the smaller family-run or newer businesses that a lot of Black entrepreneurs tend to have. And the same thing is true in the Latino community, by the way. It's just not the same exact culture of dealing with the federal government, maybe in that regard, like some more legacy and larger businesses have. So one thing that we need to get better at is designing our small business programs to actually suit the customer, and we eventually got it right on like the second or third try. We gave a lot more of the federal money to some of the community development, federal or financial institutions, and ones that have been a little bit more focused on minority entrepreneurs for a long time. And they were able to get the money where it needed to go. But that took a couple rounds. And so as a senator, I'm someone who would be trying to work with the community on the front end to get that right and get people the help that they deserve. There's another thing we did in the big infrastructure bill you might have heard about that we passed last year. It's an enormous amount of money over the next 10 years. And it's already, for example, if you saw the bridge that collapsed when President Biden came to visit, it's already rebuilding that bridge. So this is a really important federal spending. One of the things that we put in there was giving a permanent budget to an entity called the Minority Business Development Agency. And it sits in the Department of Commerce. And their whole job is basically to help Black and Latino entrepreneurs get better access to credit and to federal contracts. So, in this infrastructure bill, for example, if you had a Black entrepreneur that owned a paving company, or even like a janitorial company, or anyone that could do a little bit of business with the federal government, this agency's job would be to come in and help you make the connections that you need to make to get contracts like that. It's a very inside baseball type of world, federal contracts. It's the same people that get them over and over again. It's kind of complicated. But I believe that if we're going to spend $2 trillion of the public's money, we shouldn't just build roads and bridges themselves. We should try to be rebuilding entire communities. And a big part of a community is having small and medium-sized businesses that everyone feels like they can have a chance to compete in, not just the same old, basically white general contractors. So I think if we do a good job with an agency like that, we can start to change the history a little bit of who gets access to things like that, and maybe encourage some business development as well.
Perfect. And since you mentioned bridges, it's a perfect segue into my next question. We know the infrastructure bill has promised, billions of investments in the coming years. We've already seen some of that work right here in Pennsylvania. What other projects would you like to see outside of the bridges invested in Pennsylvania? And as you go, and lobby, whether your fellow congressmen or your fellow senators in November, what are some other projects you would like to see invested in here in Pennsylvania?
Definitely. Well, when it comes to, just sort of basic transportation infrastructure, I would say, let's keep remembering public transit. There's this whole issue right now of trying to help people get back into the workforce and earn more and all that kind of thing. The Port Authority is a key component in that, because you have so many people that don't really live all that close to where they work, and they may not own a car. So, increasing the amount of bus lines, the frequency that those buses run, just doing more to give people flexible options to get to work is an enormous thing we can do to help people. And that kind of falls squarely in transportation and infrastructure for sure. Long term, there's a lot we need to do with the energy grid and how we make energy to deal with climate change. That's another big area that I'm happy to talk about. But then I would say the last thing we need to be thinking about here is, there's sometimes when we talk about like energy and climate change and infrastructure, we get very focused on the future and what industries are going to look like in the future. And that's exciting. It's important. But I think if we did a better job really focusing on what are the jobs that people have right now, what are the fastest growing jobs, what are the jobs where you need a lot of people that we're not getting, and how can we get more people into these jobs where they can earn more? That's a really important way to help people now, not sometime in the future. So one of the fastest growing jobs in Pennsylvania is basically a home health care aide. So someone who goes to a senior citizen's home or someone with a disability, and it might only be for a few hours a day for that person, but you're helping bathe them, change them, feed them, do the ordinary tasks of everyday life that a senior who lives alone or someone with a disability might not be able to do. Very important work. It's actually crucial, not just for being kind of humane, but it's really good if we can keep seniors in their homes longer, because it's a lot less expensive than putting them into a nursing home. And actually most people prefer to stay in their own homes too. So it's a really good way to do things. It's a little hard to recruit people into that workforce right now because the pay is so low. A lot of them make only $12 or $13 an hour. And a lot of the funding comes from the government. So you can't just raise the pay. When Amazon goes up to $16 an hour, the home healthcare workers don't go up. Also, their rate is fixed by the government. So I've been really trying to see if we can raise wages for those people. It's a lot of women and a lot of women of color that do that kind of work. Same thing for people that work in nursing homes themselves, by the way, or long-term care. it's a huge growing industry in our state because we just happen to be a more elderly state, and we have a lot of people aging in to the time when they need these services. We don't have the workforce that's ready for it. So if we could pass a bill to put more money into this sort of part of the healthcare workforce where people could do these jobs, take care of seniors, keep them in their homes, and earn enough to make a living and stay in that profession, maybe even form a union and be able to bargain for good benefits over time. And then I would say childcare is very similar in that you need government funding to make sure enough people are getting paid enough to provide childcare for everyone that needs it. So those are two areas I think we could make a big impact on the economy of Western Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much. And talking about, this bills and this legislation, we know all of this is really incumbent upon if people go out and vote, not only in the May 17th primary, but in the election in November. Are you at all worried that the national conversation is going to have a negative impact on the ability for you to run your race and to speak specifically about issues that impact people in Pennsylvania?
Yes, I am. That's just part of politics, though. So that part of it is really nothing new for me. And I think if your viewers are looking for something that makes me different than the other people I'm running against in this Senate primary, I've faced Republicans before head to head. I've done it 3 times in congressional elections, and every time the national conversation has affected my campaign. If you watch a lot of TV here, you might remember Donald Trump came to my district 3 times, each one of those campaigns, to tell people not to vote for me. And he sort of started a national conversation that Democrats were against the police and against natural gas and all these things that are sort of popular in districts like mine. And we overcame it, mostly by hard work and showing up and answering people's questions, so that if they heard Donald Trump say that, I hated the police and I would never do anything to help them, they could ask me about that, and I would answer them. And I would answer them by just telling them what I had actually done already in Congress and what my record was. And I think that's going to be a good approach in this campaign as well, if I get a chance to be the nominee.
And along with that, you gave a really, impassioned plea right after January 6th and talked to me about Act 77. And still, 2 years later, we're still having these same conversations. What are you telling people when they're asking about, election integrity? Because we still are going through, locally, bills. We may not know what November election looks like. And so what are you telling people to make sure that they feel comfortable to vote and motivated to show up to the polls?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, the laws in Pennsylvania have not changed one bit since 2020. And that's thankfully because we have Tom Wolf as the governor. So your vote is going to be protected and it's going to count this year. Unfortunately, none of us can say what's going to come in the future because this has, again, unfortunately become a partisan issue. The Democrats just want everybody that wants to vote to be able to vote. We don't only want Democrats to vote. We're not trying to do anything in our own favor here. We just believe it's a fundamental right of every human being, every American, at least, to be able to vote in our elections. The Republicans don't look at it that way. They have these crazy, convoluted theories that they use to try to justify it, but they really are trying to take away the right of people to vote. And they're even willing to mess around with the vote counting process so that even after all the votes are cast, they want to control who actually counts them. So that's really the issue at stake this year when you go to vote is whether you want to protect the same right to vote for everybody going forward. And with someone like me, you'll get a vote in the Senate for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which we would use at the federal government level to stop what's happening in all these other states where they're trying to limit the right to vote. That is so crucially important. And it's really not an exaggeration to say that if we don't win this Senate race in Pennsylvania, we probably won't ever pass that bill, at least in the near term, because there's so few Senate seats available to get us into the majority to be able to pass it. We've passed it in the House 3 times since I've been there. It's never even gotten a vote in the Senate, and it probably won't until we elect another Democratic senator or 2 to get into the majority.
And talking about very important Senate votes, we know a lot of the civil rights protections really come down to a Senate vote. And we know here in Pennsylvania, there is a lot of, racial disparities, particularly when it comes to maternal health and maternal mortality. And Vice President Kamala Harris has been rolling out some future support and legislation to help investment in maternal mortality. what things are you looking for to support as a senator when it comes to issues that will allow for things to be more equitable for everyday Pennsylvanians?
Yeah, it is really shocking how inequitable it is for women of color having children in our society still. And I have one son. We're actually having a daughter in June. So I know that feeling a little bit of being in the hospital and kind of how uncertain and scary it is, for especially your first child, wanting a sense of security about what's going to happen. And I think everyone should have the same sense of security, no matter whether they're white or black. So in the House of Representatives, I have a colleague named Lauren Underwood, who's an African-American woman from the suburbs of Chicago, and she really has taken the lead on this issue, and I've just tried to support her in every way that I can. She has a whole long list of things that we need to pass into law that she calls the Momnibus bill. But the most important one, I think, is we would like to give automatic Medicaid health coverage to every new mother in the United States, no matter who they are or how much money they earn or what they look like or anything, automatic for 1 year from when you give birth, to make sure that in those crucial postpartum months, mom is covered. No matter what happens to her, she's covered. She can go to the doctor, go to the hospital, get mental health treatment if she needs it. That's one of many things we passed in the House of Representatives, and it was ignored in the Senate, and not a single Republican voted for it. And that was one where I shouldn't be surprised at this point, I guess, but they're the party that they call themselves pro-life, meaning they want every pregnancy to have a birth at the end of it. And they always say that they're going to take care of new mothers if they make that decision. And yet here they had the opportunity to vote for a government program that would actually give health insurance to every new mother for a year to make it easier for them to have children. And every one of these guys voted against it. So it shows you what they're about at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you for that, and I really appreciate you talking about like the bill that Congressman Warren is putting out. And as we wrap up, there has been, like I said, a lot of things happening, on this campaign trail, and you have really been talking about not only your vision, but what sets you apart from your other colleagues. We know, the leading controversy around, the jogger situation, like here in Pennsylvania, was one of, the other participants in the race. Has that message been resonating with people across Pennsylvania? And what do you want the story to be that now we're talking about the lack of an apology, or if there's going to be an apology, what is the takeaway that you want people once they hear the story? Because we talk about how back and forth politics is, but you've been able to bring this to light in a very nuanced way. And can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Yes, it has come up a lot, especially when I've been in Philadelphia. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone with all that's gone on in this country, particularly a case like the Ahmaud Arbery case. I think, there's more and more attention to the fact that it's just wrong to go around pointing guns at unarmed Black people, right? We should have known that already, but we've never known it more than we know it right now. In this case in particular, I think it's important to realize that, there was never any active shooter found. Chris, the person that Fetterman pointed the gun at, was dressed as a jogger with earphones in and had no gun or anything else on him. So it was a case where what Fetterman did was wrong. There's really no debate about whether what he did was wrong. It was wrong. And so I think that's where I start with it from. If you do the wrong thing, everyone does something wrong at some point in their life. I'm not saying everyone does something like that, but everyone does something wrong. I know I have. We're all sinners at the end of the day. But what I was taught about being in a position of leadership is that if you do the wrong thing, being accountable, the word accountability, and I come out of the military, as some of you know, accountability is a big value for us. You admit it. You say you're sorry, but most importantly, you just acknowledge that you were wrong so that people understand that you know what's right and what's wrong. And they think about that for your future decision making. And if you're asking what I think the biggest issue here is, it's not that John did the wrong thing or made a mistake. He made a big mistake. But if you do that, all you have to do is say you're sorry and acknowledge that it was the wrong thing to do. And he won't do that. And as a result, the story that he tells about what happened doesn't really add up. I mean, he says there's an active shooter. There was no active shooter ever found. He says that he was worried about a school shooting. It was a Saturday afternoon. He says now that he didn't point the gun at the guy. At the time, the police report said that he did. So I mean, there's just things like that that don't really add up. And when you get into a general election and more people are being exposed to Fetterman and his story for the first time, especially in such a high stakes race like this one, even a small number of people getting turned off by him because of that and because of this sort of weird way that he deals with it could cost us the whole election, in addition to, again, the fact that it is wrong to do something like that. So I think it has to be talked about right now. It's uncomfortable. I know that. And I try not to bring it up any more than I have to, but I do think it's an important issue to consider for a leadership position of this importance.
Thank you for that. And you talked about, right and wrongs. What are some of the things that you want people to take away from this interview, from getting to know you, especially right now? We're having this larger conversation about moderates, progressives. We're all, trying to do the right thing when it comes to electoral politics. What do you want people to know about you?
Sure. Well, I think on the point about moderates and progressives, I'm not really sure who that distinction helps at the end of the day, other than Republicans. It sort of keeps us focused on each other and our differences while, they try to get away with murder. So I think if all of us agree that what we're trying to do is make actual progress in the real world, not just sort of take stands, but achieve results that make people's lives better. And I've mentioned a lot of specific bills tonight that I think could do that I've supported, then we're pretty much all on the same side. And the question becomes, what does it take to actually win a seat like this to get to the place where we need to cast those votes? And that's where I think I just give you a better chance at that than anybody else running for this, for some of the reasons we've talked about. And I just want to add to that I've mentioned a couple of times accountability, and I also really believe in respect. And I think that part of what this interview is for me is a continuation of what I've done for 4 years of showing up really anywhere that anyone that I represent or wants to represent has questions or wants to talk about the issues. And there's no question I'm afraid of or that I won't take. Hopefully, if you take nothing else away from this interview, you'll see that I tried to answer the questions that were asked. You may or may not always agree with my answers, but I really do try to answer them. And I think you deserve to expect that from anyone that wants to represent you in any capacity, whether it's the U.S. Senate, down to your school board or city council or anything in between.
Thank you. And so as we come to a close, if you could just talk about, one, how people can get in contact with your campaign. And then our final question we ask every panelist is, what is bringing you joy? So how can we get in contact with your campaign? And the wrap up is, what is bringing you joy?
What is bringing me joy?
Yes.
Is that what you said? Okay, cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can get in contact with my campaign at connorlamb.com. And a lot of ways to find us there, ask more questions, sign up to volunteer to help us. We're a very grassroots campaign. Would love to have your help here in these final 3 weeks. When you ask what is bringing me joy, the first thing I think of is my son is, I guess he's about 16 and a half months old right now. So he's up, he's walking, he's running around. He's super joyful all the time. And sometimes when his bath is immediately over, he's so excited to get back out and run around again that he slips out of his mom's hands and basically runs around our house naked until he falls over from being wet and slipping. And so my wife will catch that on video from time to time and just send it to me out where I am on the campaign trail with no explanation. And it's the hardest I laugh and the happiest I get all day.
Well, thank you so much to Congressman Connor Lamb for taking a moment to join us for the Sunday Night Sit Down. We wish you the best of luck on your campaign.
It's great talking to you, Miracle. Thank you for having me on and for everything you guys are doing.
Of course. Thank you so much. And again, this has been another edition of the Sunday Night Sit Down. As a reminder, the deadline to register to vote is going to be on May 2nd. That's going to be tomorrow, y'all. If you want to vote on the May 17th primary, you must be registered to vote. As a reminder, we just went through redistricting. So if you have moved, you need to go back and double check and update your voter registration because you may have moved into a new district and you may not be aware. So again, please, please, please make sure you are registered to vote. Make sure you have gone in and updated your voter registration by the deadline on Monday, May 2nd. Again, with redistricting, you may be in a totally new district, a totally new ward. So again, you want to double check. You only have one time. Again, that is one time to vote. If you've moved and your voter file is not correct in Pennsylvania, you're allowed one courtesy vote at your prior precinct. If your information is incorrect, you've done your courtesy already, you can only do a provisional ballot. So you want to make sure that you are registered to vote. Lastly, we have a lot of great things happening, so you want to make sure you save the date for Saturday, May 14th. It's going to be one of our voter pop-up parties, as well as May 10th. We're going to be joining a couple organizations for a Get Out the Vote tour. So again, make sure you are registered to vote, and then we'll see you back next Sunday for another edition of the Sunday Night Sit Down. Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye.